I wasn't even going to make this video, because at first glance, this looked simple. The US rushed the USS Tripoli toward the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz was getting more dangerous by the day, and the obvious answer seemed to be, well, of course they moved another big ship. Tensions are high, but that's surface-level thinking, because the Tripoli is not just another gray hull moving across a map. It's not some routine symbol. It's not there to look impressive in a headline and disappear into the background. When the US sends a ship like this toward the Strait of Hormuz, it's because Washington wants options. Fast options, hard options, political options, military options. And in a crisis like this, the country with the most options usually controls the pressure. That's the real story. The exact incident is this. As the war around Iran widened and threats to Gulf shipping intensified, the U.S. moved the America-class amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli and about 2,500 Marines toward the Middle East, while President Trump pushed other countries to contribute ships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Recent reporting says the Tripoli deployment came as Iranian attacks disrupted regional energy infrastructure and shipping, and as Trump asked around 7 countries to join a coalition to police the strait. And that matters for 3 reasons. First, the Tripoli gives the U.S. a flexible crisis response platform right next to one of the world's most sensitive waterways. Second, it gives Washington more than firepower. It gives Washington speed, Marines, aircraft, command presence, and the ability to respond across multiple scenarios without immediately committing to the biggest possible move. And third, it sends a message to everyone watching that the U.S. is preparing for a messy crisis, not a neat one. That's the spine of this whole story. Because a lot of people hear Navy ship and picture one job: escort tankers, launch jets, show the flag. But the Tripoli is valuable precisely because it lets the U.S. do several things at once. It can carry Marines, support aviation, push deterrence, give commanders options for evacuations or raids or crisis response moves, and sit in the background as a very visible reminder that America is not leaving the region to improvise alone. The Tripoli Expeditionary Strike Group has been operating with the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, and official Navy and Marine Corps releases show F-35B operations from the ship in recent months. That's why the first reason matters so much. The U.S. rushed the Tripoli because the Strait of Hormuz is not the kind of place where you want one-dimensional tools. This is not a clean battlefield. It's a pressure point, a bottleneck, a narrow, politically loaded maritime corridor where commercial shipping, regional militaries, global energy markets, and great powers signaling all pile into the same patch of water at the same time. AP described the strait this week as a critical oil shipping route, and the broader reporting says Iranian attacks and threats have already choked or disrupted shipping through it. And when the problem is that complicated, you do not just want a ship that can shoot. You want a ship that can adapt. That's what the Tripoli gives you. Think about the range of problems Washington may be staring at all at once. Tanker escorts, air cover, emergency extraction, protection of U.S. citizens or facilities, show of force patrols, coordination with Marines, pressure on hostile small boat activity, response to attacks on infrastructure, readiness if the crisis spreads beyond shipping. That's not one mission. That's a menu of possible missions. And the Tripoli is built for menus. That's the concrete example here. Official Navy and Marine releases show the Tripoli operating with the 31st MEU and Marine F-35BS, which gives it far more flexibility than a ship that only does one thing well. It is not just a carrier, not just a transport, not just an amphibious ship in the old sense. It is a floating platform for a crisis that may change shape every 12 hours. And here's the punchline for reason 1. The U.S. rushed the Tripoli because Hormuz is not a place for a single answer. It's a place for stacked options. That is what this ship represents. Now let's go to the second reason, because this is where the story gets more interesting. The Tripoli is not just useful because it is powerful. It is useful because it lets Washington move hard without looking like it has already chosen the hardest possible path. That distinction matters, because in a crisis this tense, signaling is everything. If the U.S. sends too little, it looks weak. If it sends the biggest possible force package immediately, it can look like it is preparing for a full-scale escalation. So what do you send when you want to deter, reassure, posture, and preserve flexibility all at once? You send something like the Tripoli. That's why an amphibious assault ship is so politically useful. It can carry serious capability, but it does not automatically scream the same message as a full carrier strike response. It says readiness without necessarily saying war plan finalization. It says, we are preparing for multiple outcomes, which is exactly what Washington wants the region, its allies, and Iran to hear. And that fits the current moment perfectly. Trump has been publicly pressing other countries to send ships to help secure the strait, but AP's reporting says there have been no firm commitments from many of the countries he approached. In other words, Washington is asking for coalition help while also preparing for the possibility that coalition help arrives late, arrives weak, or arrives in politically limited form. That is a big clue, because when allies hesitate, the US still has to shape the battlefield. It still has to shape the political mood. It still has to show shipping markets, Gulf partners, and Tehran that it has not lost initiative. And the Tripoli helps do that. It lets Washington cover the gap between what it wants others to do and what others are actually willing to do. That's the concrete example for reason 2. AP reported that Trump sought a coalition to police the strait, naming countries heavily dependent on the route and saying he had asked around 7 nations for warships, even as many responded cautiously. At the same time, AP reported that the US was deploying the Tripoli and 2,500 Marines to the Middle East as part of the military buildup around the conflict. And the punchline is simple. The Tripoli was not rushed there because the coalition was already strong. It was rushed there because the coalition looked uncertain. That changes how you should read this move. This was not just force projection. It was coalition insurance. Now let's get to the third reason, because this is the one that ties the military and political story together. The Tripoli was rushed because Washington believes the next phase of this crisis could get ugly in ways that don't fit neatly into one category. That's what people miss. They talk about Hormuz like it's just an oil story, or just a Navy story, or just a Trump story. It's all of those things at once. Energy pressure, maritime pressure, regional military pressure, alliance pressure, domestic political pressure. The US is not responding to one risk. It is responding to the possibility that several risks stack on top of each other at the same time. And when that happens, the side that can absorb surprise usually has the advantage. That's where the Tripoli comes in again. Because this ship, with Marines and aviation capability embarked, is not just about winning one type of engagement. It's about being less surprised when the crisis stops behaving the way planners hoped it would. Imagine the spectrum. Maybe the job is mostly deterrence and presence. Maybe it becomes escorts and rapid response. Maybe there is a need for evacuation support. Maybe the crisis spills into surrounding coastal zones. Maybe missile or drone attacks push the mission beyond commercial shipping security. Maybe Washington needs a platform that can project force, move personnel, and support fast decisions without waiting for a slower buildup. That is exactly why you move this kind of ship early. Because once the strait is already in full chaos, you are no longer buying readiness. You are paying for delay. And delay in Hormuz is expensive. Not just in military terms, in political terms, in economic terms, in psychological terms. Every extra day of uncertainty around that waterway hits shipping confidence, insurance, oil expectations, regional nerves, and the credibility of the country claiming it can keep global trade moving. That is why AP's reporting on the wider conflict matters here. Iranian attacks have targeted regional oil infrastructure and airports, while the Strait of Hormuz has become a focal point of global energy anxiety and coalition diplomacy. This is not a small local maritime incident. It is a live pressure point in a broader regional war. That's the concrete example for reason 3. The Tripoli is not being sent into a quiet shipping lane with one mission and one timetable. It is moving into a live escalation zone where the US wants the ability to shift gears faster than the crisis does. And the punchline for reason 3 is this. Washington rushed the Tripoli because it doesn't trust this crisis to stay narrow. That is the deepest reason of all. Now, to be fair, there is a counterpoint here, and it matters. The deployment of a ship like the Tripoli does not automatically mean the US expects a direct major naval battle tomorrow. It does not prove that an invasion is coming. It does not mean Washington has already decided on the most escalatory path. In a crisis, big deployments are often about precaution, signaling, and contingency planning just as much as they are about imminent combat. The evidence we have publicly is that the US is reinforcing the region, pushing for a coalition, and responding to escalating threats to shipping and energy infrastructure. That counterpoint is important because it keeps the analysis honest. But it doesn't weaken the core argument. If anything, it strengthens it. Because precaution is the point. The US rushed the Tripoli not because every scenario is certain, but because too many bad scenarios are plausible. And in military planning, plausibility is enough to move steel. That is how serious crises work. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. The Tripoli was not sitting nearby as a spare asset with no other strategic value. It was forward deployed in the Pacific, operating as part of the Tripoli Expeditionary Strike Group with the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, and official releases as recently as February show F-35B flight operations aboard the ship. In other words, moving it is not nothing. It is a reallocation of a real capability from another major theater into this one. That should tell you how Washington is prioritizing risk. Because major powers do not casually move versatile platforms out of one strategic context into another unless they think the receiving crisis needs real flexibility fast. And flexibility is the key word here. Not just firepower, not just symbolism. Flexibility. That's why the Tripoli matters more than the average viewer realizes. If all Washington wanted was a TV image, there are easier ways to get one. If all it wanted was one extra hull in the region, there are other ways to do that too. But if it wanted an adaptable, politically useful, militarily credible, marine-capable, aviation-capable platform that can help bridge the gap between peacetime signaling and wartime options, then yes, the Tripoli starts to look exactly like the right tool. That's the bigger lesson. The ship itself is the message. And the message is not subtle. The US is telling Iran, its allies, the shipping world, and the global oil market that it is preparing for a Hormuz crisis that could mutate quickly. It is telling allies that even if coalition building is slower than Washington wants, the US is not waiting empty-handed. And it is telling everyone watching that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer being treated like a side theater. It is being treated like a strategic pressure valve. That's why the pacing of this move matters too. AP reported that Trump was publicly asking countries for warships while the region faced widening Iranian strikes and attacks on infrastructure. Around the same period, reports said the Pentagon was sending more warships and Marines to the Middle East, including the Tripoli and its embarked Marines. When requests for coalition help and force movements happen together, that usually means Washington is trying to do two things at once: build legitimacy and build leverage. That is not random sequencing. That is strategy. And there's one more angle people should not ignore. The Tripoli carries not just military effect, but decision space. That may sound abstract, but it matters. Leaders hate crises that corner them into binary choices. Do nothing or escalate massively. Those are bad options. Ships like the Tripoli are useful because they create middle space. Enough power to matter. Enough flexibility to adjust. Enough visibility to deter. Enough capability to act if deterrence fails. In other words, the Tripoli buys time without looking passive. That is incredibly valuable in a place like Hormuz. Because every day in that strait is a competition between fear and confidence. Fear in the markets. Fear among shipping companies. Fear among regional governments. Fear among allies deciding whether to join in. Confidence in deterrence. Confidence in escorts. Confidence in US response speed. Confidence that the waterway won't collapse into a prolonged choke point. And when confidence starts slipping, Washington reaches for platforms that can restore it. That's another way of saying the Tripoli is not just being sent for what it can destroy. It is being sent for what it can stabilize. At least, that's the intention. Whether that intention works is a different question. Because there is always a risk that more military presence deters aggression. But there is also a risk that more presence gives the crisis more targets, more chances for miscalculation, and more ways for everyone to read each other's moves as preparation for something larger. That is the dark side of deterrence. It can reassure one audience while alarming another. But even that supports the basic argument. If Washington were still treating Hormuz as a manageable background concern, it would not pay those risks. It would not move a platform like this. It would not be chasing allied ships while shifting Marines and aviation toward the region. The fact that it is doing those things tells you what you need to know. This crisis has moved up the priority ladder. Fast. So here's the clean recap. The US rushed the USS Tripoli to the Strait of Hormuz because the strait has become a live strategic choke point in a wider war, not just a shipping lane. It rushed the ship because the Tripoli brings exactly the kind of flexible capability Washington wants in a crisis that could shift from deterrence to escort to evacuation to broader military response with very little warning. And it rushed the ship because coalition support still looks uncertain, which means America wants a platform that can project strength, buy time, reassure markets and partners, and preserve options before the situation gets even uglier. That's the story. Not that the US suddenly panicked. Not that one ship solves Hormuz. And not that this automatically means a full-scale regional war is inevitable. The real story is that Washington saw a bottleneck crisis forming in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth and reached for one of the few platforms that can do more than one job when the map starts changing faster than the headlines. And that leaves one real question. Was the Tripoli rushed in time to stabilize Hormuz? Or is this the kind of move great powers make when they know the next phase is going to be much messier than anyone wants to admit?